Hello there, welcome back to Jennie Designs with Paper and this week's episode of Crime and Coloring, where we take an alphabetical journey through the United States and revisit some of the earliest crimes. But before we talk crime, let's talk coloring. So today I am using the Altenew Bougainvillea, I think is how you say this. This is one of their Create a Garden stamp and die sets. There are stencils that go to this set. I do not have them. I will be creating a yellow bougainvillea. I will be using Copic markers. I have a piece of Neenah Classic Crest Silver White 80-pound cardstock. At first, I tried to use a quarter of the sheet, but the bougainvillea is quite large, and so I had to up it to a half a sheet of cardstock. I will also be using Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink because it is alcohol marker friendly. One of the really cool things about Altenew stamp sets is that the insert inside the stamp set has color combinations and color examples. It's just, their inserts are wonderful. So I'm going to go ahead and do a yellow bougainvillea. I did Google search to see what colors and they come in pinks and purples and oranges and corals and yellows. And I went with a yellow bougainvillea because that's just kind of how I was feeling. I love me some yellow flowers. So, one other thing, you will notice that I will refill on my Copic markers. One of my yellows was almost completely dry, and I decided to leave that in just in case you've never done it before to show you how really easy it is. So, now that we've talked about the coloring, let's go ahead and talk about the crime. So, our journey today takes us back to the state of Oregon. And first, let's have a quick review of the statehood of Oregon. Like most states admitted to the Union in the mid-1800s, slavery was the foremost topic in the statehood talks. The territory of Oregon applied for statehood 3 times, and each time the big hurdle was free state or slave state. Oregon was eventually admitted to the Union on February 14, 1859 as a free state, but nobody in Oregon knew until March 15th. And the plan was to be a refuge for any and all. But the state of Oregon had a whites-only clause in its constitution very temporarily. Oregon, a place I have actually called home twice in my married life, is unique in more than one way. The state flag is the only state in the Union to have a double-sided flag. One of the most important questions are you a duck or a beaver? With OSU and U of O being only about 90 minutes apart, allegiance is a real thing. Oregon is home to the deepest freshwater lake, the smallest park, the shortest river, and the deepest gorge. You can find the home of Nike and Tillamook cheese in Oregon. There are some unusual laws in Oregon as well. In Stanfield, no more than 2 people can share a drink. You cannot fish with canned corn, and in Myrtle Creek, you cannot box a kangaroo. Oregon is the inspiration for the Springfield in the Simpsons TV show, and Clint Eastwood even called Oregon home at one point. There is a town called Sisters and a town called Brothers. The first female mayor was elected in 1949, and one of the first things she did was outlaw pinball machines. I have no context for that. Lava Lake in Deschutes County was created by a lava flow from volcanoes. It is a relatively shallow lake, being only about 30 to 40 feet deep at its deepest. There are no surface streams that add water to the lake. It is completely fed by underground streams. And Lava Lake was a temporary resting place to 3 murdered men, one of Oregon's oldest unsolved murders. So, fur trapping was a moneymaker in the early 1900s, especially in the Oregon area. And in the winter of 1923, there were 3 men who decided they were going to spend the winter trapping. So Edward Nichols, Roy Wilson, and Dewey Morris. Sorry, I had some dental work done today, and my mouth is still a little bit weird. Anyway, these 3 men took up residence in a log cabin that was owned by Ed Logan. And in trade for staying in this cabin rent-free, they were also there to take care of his property. So a little background on our 3 victims. Edward was born to Thomas and Rachel Nichols on June 12, 1870 in Marion Township, Ohio. He was the oldest of their 4 children, all boys. He married Elizabeth Ann Young on April 14th of 1895. They were parents to 2 daughters. However, Edward and Elizabeth were divorced. I could not find a divorce date, but they did eventually separate. Also interesting, Edward spells his name Nickols, but his parents spell their surname Nichols, and I noticed that difference on his find-a-grave. Now, Henry Leroy Roy Wilson was born to Charles and Sarah Wilson on January 12th of 1888. He was the second of 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, and it doesn't seem that Roy ever married, but in 1918 he did join the Marines and served as a Marine for some time. And his mom was actually the catalyst in finding what had happened to these gentlemen. There is not a lot of information about Dewey Morris. His find-a-grave lists his birth as the year 1900, but not a month or a day. And it makes him the youngest of the 3 men in our story today. His find-a-grave, though, does not name his parents or whether or not he was married or anything like that. So very little information about Dewey. So these 3 men were loggers who made their home in Bend, Oregon. Now, Bend is about halfway between the west and the east coast. Maybe not quite halfway, maybe a third of the way in east. And it's kind of in the middle of nowhere. And they decided that instead of spending the winter not working, because logging in the wintertime was not always profitable, they made a deal with Ed to take care of his land and cabin so they could stay there and trap the area. They were hunting specifically for fox pelts, I believe. So the men moved into the cabin the fall of 1923, and they really began their trapping right away. Now, the week before Christmas, Edward went back to Bend, and he was reportedly in a really good mood, and he had a sled full of really expensive furs that he sold in town. So these men were really good at their trade. He told the locals rather, that things at the cabin were going great and that the men were being very successful in their trapping endeavors. On January 15th of 1924, a man named Alan Wilcoxon, he was a resort owner, and he was traveling by snowshoe from his home in Fall River to his resort at Elk Lake, and he stopped by the cabin to visit the men. He also was a friend of Ed, the cabin owner. So Alan spent the evening there. He hung out with the men, and the next day he got up and traveled on. And when he reached Elk Lake on the 16th of January, he reported that the men were all 3 in good spirits and in good health, and they were having some really great success. That was the last time that these 3 men were ever seen alive. So on March 1st, 1924, the new year rolls around, and Sarah Wilson, Roy's mom, sounded the alarm. So according to her report to authorities, Roy had promised his mom, Sarah, that he would return to Bend in February. Now, even allowing for bad weather, Sarah was sure that it would not have taken him a month to get back to home, and that something had to be wrong out at the cabin on Lava Lake. Her report to authorities was that Roy's word as a Marine was as good as gold, and nothing would keep him from returning to town after he told his mom he would do so. So she was convinced that the only reason Roy did not keep his word to come home in February was that he was injured, ill, or dead. Something was wrong. And she actually said, "I think he's been murdered." Now, why did she jump straight to murder, not illness or injury, Well, let me tell you a story about that. So according to Sarah, Roy, who was looking forward to a profitable winter trapping with good company, was actually approached by Edward to spend the winter with him and Dewey. There had been a bit of a kerfuffle between Edward and a man who he called Lee Collins, a former work partner. So Lee Collins was kind of reportedly a goofy-looking guy from Idaho, and reports said he was a bit slow-witted. So his train didn't go all the way to the station, maybe? I don't know what that meant, but that was people's impression of him. So Lee had actually spent the previous winter at the same cabin trapping with Edward. But at the end of that trapping season in the spring, fur prices were down substantially from the winter before, and they were not going to make the money that they had planned to make. So Edward's plan was to just store the furs until the next fur trapping season, when the prices would go back up and they could get more money from them. Now, Lee, he did not like the wait and see approach, and he actually felt like he was being cheated. So his response to Edward's plan to wait and see was that he went back to the cabin and stole $500 from Edward's hiding place and then took off. So Edward reported the theft to the authorities, and the authorities did a little investigating, and they told him that Lee Collins wasn't actually the slow-witted guy that Edward thought he was. His name was actually Charles Hyde Kinsey, and he was a convict who had recently escaped from this Idaho State Penitentiary. He had been serving a 14 or 15-year sentence for burglary. One source said 14, one said 15. So, oops, right? Edward had unknowingly entangled himself with a convicted and escaped felon. So, with the information that Edward had about Charles, aka Lee, the authorities were hot on his trail. However, he did manage to slip away. So Sarah knew this because the reason that Edward invited Roy to come trap with them was that Roy had training in defense. He was a Marine, and part of his job was to act as the defense or the security for these three men. So after Sarah reports her suspicions to the authorities and to the local people in the area, some family members were convinced by her thought process to ride out to Lava Lake and check on the cabin and the men residing in it. And they actually arrived at the cabin on April 13th, 1924. So it took Sarah some time to convince people something was wrong, but then also it's the desert mountain, right? You have to wait for the snow to thaw a bit. So they waited until April, where travel would be more safe. And when these family members arrived at the cabin, it was clear almost immediately that Sarah was right. Something was very, very wrong. At first glance around the cabin, it showed that it had been unoccupied for some time. Like the wall calendar still had January showing. It had never been flipped. The last meal eaten in the cabin appeared to have been a breakfast, but no one had bothered to clean up or put the dishes away. The whole cabin was untidy. It was messy, and that was not at all in character with Edward and Dewey and Roy, especially a Marine, how they would have kept their home. And those details could have been explained. Maybe somebody came upon the empty cabin and, took shelter for a few days and then left. However, the men's gear was still there. Their bedrolls were still on the beds. Most of their heavy winter clothing was still there. All of their weapons were in the cabin except for one. And where would three men have gone in the middle of the winter without heavy clothing, and if they were hunting and trapping without their weapons? That was the big one. That was the big indicator that this is bad. This is really bad. Now, another thing they noticed is that part of the buildings of this cabin, there was a pen for the foxes. So I'm gathering that the process was that the foxes were trapped and kept in a pen, and then butchered for their meat and their pelts at a later date, because inside this fox pen, there was still food there, but there were no animals in the hutch. None. So these family members of Roy, they set out following the trail of traps. And what they found were that the traps had been sprung, and some of the traps had dead animals that were still stuck in them, and they appeared to have died from starvation or dehydration, which was not in keeping of the way that these men were known to have hunted and trapped. They were not cruel to the animals that they were hunting. It was just completely out of their normal practice. The other thing that was really peculiar is that there were zero, none, nada, no pelts in or around the cabin. None. And in January, it was reported that they were doing quite well. So this investigation continued, and then on April 20th, the men investigating found a big spot of blood in the snow, kind of sandwiched between two layers of snow. As things were melting, they were starting to notice this, and it seemed as though the blood had been frozen almost as soon as it had hit the ground, and that it had been sandwiched between the layers of snow for quite a while. They also found some visible tracks. They were tracks that were impressions in the snow, but then had been filled up with another layer of snow. And the tracks were the tracks of a sled. And the depth of the tracks indicated that the sled was really heavy, and it was being pulled toward a section called Big Lava Lake. So following those tracks, these men investigating the disappearance of these three men found that the tracks went clear out onto the lake and stopped at a spot where someone had chopped a hole in the ice. The hole was just big enough to slip a grown human male body through it. Upon inspection of the hole in the ice, they found a medium-length strand of sandy brown hair, and it was caught in a crack near the edge of the ice. Then someone found the missing foxes, the ones from the fox hutch. They had been killed and skinned, and then their carcasses had been hidden in the bushes. Like they weren't even used properly or used completely. And this led the men to unanimously reach the conclusion that there was no doubt. These trappers had clearly been murdered, and the motive was either robbery for these really, the pelts that were valuable, or revenge. Remember, Charles, a.k.a. Lee, and him and Edward still have some words going on. So, things are progressing, and a few days after the cabin had been, after the search of the cabin had been reported to and printed in the local news, there was a man in Portland who was a furrier, a man who bought pelts. His name was Carl Shoemaker, and he actually contacted the police to tell them that a man had brought in 4 fox pelts on January 22nd, 7 days after the 3 men had last been reportedly seen alive. So Carl remembered the situation very well because it was kind of odd. It was odd because the pelts were mishandled. The trapper, who sat there and chatted with him for like 90 minutes about trapping and all the things related to that, talked a good game. He talked like he knew how to do all of the things right. But the pelts themselves hadn't been properly stretched out. There was some question about, like Carl didn't think they had been skinned properly. And it actually devalued the pelts. They weren't ruined. They were still usable. But the way in which that they had been skinned and then stretched devalued them. So this man who's talking the talk clearly knows the talk, but doesn't know how to do what was the norm, right? So Coincidentally, by the time Carl had contacted the police, they were actually already looking into Charles, aka Lee, as a suspect based on his involvement with Edward the winter before and his theft of Edward's cash money. They did show Carl a photograph, and he couldn't positively ID the man who sold him the pelts, but he did say that it looked a lot like the guy. And Charles was still nowhere to be found. There was still no sign of him when 1 month rolled around, and then 2 months rolls around, and then the ice in the lake melted, and all 3 men, the remains of all 3 men were found floating in the lake. So police were able to tow them to shore, and an autopsy was performed, and the evidence found put aside any lingering doubts that this had been anything but murder. So the autopsy revealed that Edward had been hit with a shotgun blast at close range, and it had actually, was very close range. It took away part of his face and his chest. Dewey had also been shot with a shotgun, but in the right shoulder, and then also shot with a pistol at close range to the side of his head behind his ear. But somebody had just gone, and the word the report used was berserk, with a blunt instrument, most likely a hammer, on Roy's face. So this was not a clean attack. This was a vicious, bloody attack. After the autopsies were performed, it was estimated that the murders occurred either late December or early January. And we can assume it was January because Alex had seen them alive, right? So Sheriff Macaulay wrote, quote, "Even though the weather was perfect, the clean air was impregnated with the odor of death and decomposition, and it was with an undefinable spirit of awe and consternation that the little party of hardy outdoorsmen laid aside their packs, kicked off their snowshoes, and prepared to tackle a grim job which was little to their liking." So it was not a pleasant scene. So according to a police report published in April 1824, police believed that at least 2 of the men had not been murdered in close proximity to the cabin, but had been lured away and then killed. And this led police to suspect that a woodsman and moonshiner who camped nearby at Cultus Lake, he was a man named Indian Erickson, that maybe he was involved. However, after providing an alibi, police dismissed him as a suspect and returned back to Charles, aka Lee. Now, Charles was finally caught in Kalispell, Montana in 1932, so 8 years later. And he was caught by a stroke of luck. He was walking down the street, and somebody who worked at the jail recognized him and knew that he was being sought in connection with these murders. And he did immediately after he was arrested say, quote, "They think I killed those trappers, but I didn't. I was in Colorado working on the Mafia tunnel at the time." So he immediately, upon his arrest, has an alibi. He's got an alibi. It was less than solid. And authorities were pretty sure that that he had fabricated the alibi and that they could actually break it if they dug into it. But they also figured it wasn't really worth investigating because the evidence they had against Charles was very circumstantial, and they didn't really believe they would get a conviction with that evidence. And it seemed like to the authorities that Charles knew that too. As soon as he was brought in, he acted like everything was going to come out okay. His biggest fear, it seemed, was that they were going to extradite him to Idaho, where he was still wanted for breaking out of prison for that 14 or 15-year burglary sentence. But authorities knew something that Charles didn't. About a year before the Lava Lake murders, so when Charles, aka Lee, first appeared in Edward's life, Charles had hired a car to drive him to Idaho. And then halfway there, he told the driver that he needed to, answer the call of nature. And then he clobbered the driver, a man named W.O. Harrison, knocked him out. He tied his hands and feet together with baling wire and threw him down a nearby abandoned well, expecting, of course, that he would die there. Then he drove away in the stolen car. But Harrison didn't die. He woke up, untied his wrists from the wire, climbed out of the well, found his way to a ranch, which was ironically called the Last Chance Ranch, and got help. And he was able to positively identify Charles as the man who had stolen his car and tried to kill him. So authorities also found that there was an arrest warrant for Charles in Utah for a very similar carjacking situation. Carjacking before we knew what carjacking was. So, Oregon authorities realized that an attempted murder charge for the death of Harrison would not send Charles to the gallows, right? But it would keep him locked in jail for a really long time. They were aware that their circumstantial evidence would not convict him of murder. And so the Doucette County authorities decided that they would go for a prison term. So Charles was tried and convicted for carjacking of Mr. Harrison and was given a life sentence for that crime, something that rarely happened. And a couple of decades into his life sentence, Charles actually used the disproportionateness, is that a word? Disproportionate of the sentence, that word I can't say again, to the crime. Like he said that my crime I should not be in jail for life for carjacking. The guy didn't even die, right? So in 1957, 25 years into his life sentence, and then he was in his early 70s, Charles was actually paroled. And he went to Idaho, and he lived the rest of his life without further illegal issue. So the Lava Lake triple homicide officially remains unsolved to this day. Although everybody involved are sure that Charles was the man who did this. But there are some questions. And the most forefront question is, did Charles have an accomplice? And there's two reasons for this question. So the furrier in Portland said that the man he talked to was glib and smooth talking, while Charles was known to be slow or dim-witted. But also, how did he get Edward, Dewey, and Roy away from their cabin? Edward's not going anywhere with Charles because he knows him as the man who stole his money the year before. So there had to be somebody else who could lure them away from the cabin because, like I said before, there was no sign of murder or struggle at the cabin. So an author named Melanie Tupper actually wrote a book about Central Oregon's Angel of Death. And that is a man named Ray Van Buren Jackson. And this man Jackson appears regularly, peripherally involved in about a dozen unsolved homicides in Central Oregon through the first 3 decades of the 1900s. And Jackson was exactly the kind of glib, easy talker that could have been chatting up the furrier. He was the kind of guy who could convince 3 trappers to leave their cabin and walk straight to their death. But in reality, the final analysis is nobody really knows except for who was involved. And it is extremely unlikely that any of that, the men are all gone now. Nobody's really going to know who did that. But what a crazy story. So here is my card. I hope you liked it. I did find one picture of the 3 men in front of the cabin, and I found a picture of Charles, aka Lee. So, thanks for hanging out with me today. I hope you enjoyed this story. It doesn't have an ending at all, really. I have a couple other videos here I think you would like. I also have that subscribe button. If you have not subscribed to my channel, I would love it if you did. Leave me a comment down below. Tell me how you feel about the story. Give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and have a really fabulous day.